This is the Washington Week Webcast Extra.
Hello, I'm Gwen Eiffel, and welcome. I'm joined around the table by Michael Crowley, I think of candy, of Politico, Sue Davis of USA Today, Nancy Youssef of The Daily Beast, and Pete Williams of NBC News. In a week where we've been caught up in the story of a terrorist attack in Paris, we were reminded that one played out right here at home as the Boston Marathon bombing trial began. So, one of the questions which hovers over this whole jury selection process, Pete, is how do you go about picking a jury in Boston where presumably every living sentient human being knew about this attack?
Well, the defense has made this case repeatedly. They've twice asked the judge to move the trial somewhere else, and he has twice said no, and they asked the federal appeals court to step in, and the appeals court said no, we'll leave it up to the judge. That's one of the reasons why jury selection is taking 3 weeks. It started this week. It's going to go on for 3 weeks.
Wow.
They brought all these jurors in, well over 1,200 of them. They answered. Each one had to answer a 100-question questionnaire about their views on all kinds of things. Partly it's to find a jury that is, says it can decide the case based on the evidence and not what they heard their neighbors say or what they saw in the newspaper. But secondly, because it's a death penalty case, you have to find a jury that is so-called death qualified, meaning the jurors are open to the death penalty. They're not so in favor of it that they would impose it no matter what. They're not so opposed to it that they would never impose it. And so you've got those two things together, and that's why jury selection is going to take so long. But that's exactly the point. The defense has said basically the entire city was the victim. The judge said, look what happened in the Enron case. When Enron collapsed, it affected so many people there, and yet the Supreme Court said there was nothing wrong with no change of venue. So the fact is it's very hard to get a change of venue now in federal courts.
I have to ask you about a second story that happened late on Friday, which is that the Justice Department is investigating a story we thought was long over, and that involves General David Petraeus.
Well, this investigation has been going on for a very long time, basically since Petraeus stepped down as the CIA director after about a year there in 2012. You may recall that he admitted when he stepped down that he was having an affair with a woman who wrote a book about him, and the question has been, while he was CIA director, did he give her access to classified documents? That's what the FBI has been investigating. Apparently, there are some people in the Justice Department who are upset that this case hasn't come to prosecution, that the government hasn't gone to court. Now, it's up to the Attorney General, Eric Holder. There is a recommendation before him, that's how it works in the Justice Department, that he go ahead and approve the charges. And apparently the people who leaked this to the New York Times believe that, it's a double standard, that the Justice Department has been doing an unprecedented number of prosecutions for leaks, but here they won't in Petraeus' case. So it's an attempt to kind of push the process
goose it a
along.
little bit.
Yeah.
Nancy, we spent a lot of time in the regular program tonight talking about al-Qaeda, but one of the things that we've been most focused on and that you've been writing a lot about is the U.S. plan to defeat ISIL or ISIS. And first of all, at the Pentagon, how is that coming along? And do they know what their target is, and are they making any success?
Well, this week they announced that they've hit 3,222 things as of January 7th. Like checkpoints, hundreds of I can't give you the breakdown. Checkpoints, staging areas, tanks, buildings, cars. Targets. And so a lot of people will say, well, that says progress. Look at all these things that they've hit. The problem is one doesn't know what the impact of those strikes are. For example, hitting a lot of tanks seems like a big deal, but the reality is ISIS doesn't depend on tanks. They're sort of vanity pieces, if you will. They hit a lot of checkpoints. Do we know if there were civilians at those checkpoints? They hit a lot of guard shacks. Do we know if there were people inside those guard shacks? And so in the absence of any numbers that gives a sense of impact, it's hard to measure. And the reality is, as long as fighters are continuing to come in and flow into Syria, that the core problem remains, if you will. Now, that said, the Pentagon argument is, well, look, ISIS hasn't gained any more ground in Iraq or Syria since the strike campaign began. So is it about defeating and degrading and ultimately defeating ISIS or containment?
Yeah, that has always been the complicated part with this new kind of war. I want to talk to you guys about politics. Go a little politics. Start with you.
Yeah.
Sue, Barbara Boxer, liberal lion of the Senate, announced this week to her grandson, who happens to be Hillary Clinton's nephew, I love that detail, that she's not running again. What's going to happen there?
You know, it's interesting that she decided to announce so soon into the new Congress, and then you realize...
She's up in 2016.
She's up in 2016, but it's she announced within 72 hours of the new Congress coming in, and it makes you realize that part of the reason why she did it is just how expensive it is to run a statewide race in California. Right. And she said in part the reason why she did it was, she won as a long shot candidate in 1992, which was famously known as the Year of the Woman, and nobody really gave her a chance. And she said part of her calculation was she wants to be able to give enough people a fair shot to run. And if you wait late, then people that are well-funded and better known have a better chance. And if you have 2 years to know that you might want to run for Senate, it gives people time to raise the money they need.
In California, we're talking about a Democratic primary. That's where the real fight is.
It will essentially be.
There's a Republican out there.
It's a very thin Republican bench in the state. It's not impossible, but names like Carly Fiorina come up, although she's also thinking about running for president in the context of politics. I've heard the rough ballpark that I've heard people say is you need $20 million just to be considered in the orbit of being a contender to run statewide in California.
Can I just ask briefly, would she have stayed if the Democrats had kept control of the Senate?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that. I don't know what her thought process was, but she seemed, I believe she's 72 years old, maybe 70. She's in her early 70s, and she said she wants to go back to California. And I've been to California. It's lovely. I can't blame her.
Well, and let me just ask you one more thing about her, which is I wonder whether she is setting the table for either of the names who are most frequently mentioned as a successor. That's Kamala Harris, the Attorney General, or Gavin Newsom, the former mayor of San Francisco.
She has, at least early, her statements very clearly said she didn't want to get involved, that she wanted to stay out of that. She wasn't going to pick a favorite. I think it'll be a fascinating primary. California is a state that changed their election laws. They have what we call a jungle primary, which means the top 2 vote getters go to the November ballot. So it will probably be similar to Louisiana in that their election will really be on Election Day, and it'll be 2 Democrats battling it out for California. Also, this is a state that has had no changeover in the Senate for at least 20 years, so there is a lot of pent-up down-ballot Democratic energy, so it could be an absolute free-for-all.
There is not a statewide official, Kamala Harris, but Jerry Brown, the mayor.
The governor.
The governor. Boy, he was the mayor of Oakland. The governor, and Dianne Feinstein's 81. He's in his 70s. She's in her 70s. Finally, the generation shift happens. I want to wrap this up by talking a little bit about presidential politics, Michael. Today we heard Mitt Romney say that he was considering running again for president, coincidentally on the week that Jeb Bush decided to set up his PAC. Now, before we talk about these 2 interesting gentlemen, we want to hear a little bit about, last we asked Mitt Romney what he was going to do about this. This is what he said.
I'm not running. I'm not planning on running, and that's all I got in that story.
Is that a no?
That's just what I said.
October 2014. We are now in January 2015. What's changing?
Well, part of it, I think, is just the reality of seeing, it's the piece of cake you didn't want, and then somebody else is coming for it with their fork and knife, and you think, no, actually, maybe I do. I was thinking I'd like to keep the option open, and running for president is about ego, right? And I think that it's easier to say you're not into it when it's more abstract, and then it's like, well, here comes Jeb Bush, and why is Jeb Bush any more qualified than I am? And I have a better chance of beating Hillary than Jeb does. Now, it's actually Ann Romney, who also had Mitt Romney's wife, who had some real doubts about him running again, and it sounds like she has probably gotten over that. So It's hard to know.
Wow.
Well, at least the line coming from Romney land is that she's more open to it. Who knows how much he's still trying to talk her into it. But it's going to be great fun to see those guys run against each other if it does happen.
The one thing you wrote a piece about the burden of Jeb Bush this week, and I wonder if that is, Jeb Bush is not the lock that so many people think.
No, I think he's, look, the shadow of his brother is going to loom long and large. Now, it is true that George W. Bush's public approval numbers have come up since he left office, and people look a little more favorable. But that's because we're not really thinking so much about the particulars of his presidency.
Leaving office really helps your approval numbers.
It really does. And in particular, I'm very interested. I cover foreign policy, and I'm interested in the question of, because W's foreign policy was so divisive and sort of notorious that war was so unpopular. By the way, his numbers are up, but public opinion saying that the Iraq War was a mistake has not moved, and that's about 2/3 of Americans saying it was a mistake. To what degree is that going to be a big challenge for him? I did some reporting on this that people can read. I think it's speculative, but to me, one of the most interesting questions if he does run.
Oh boy, 2016. I'm very happy it's so far, so close, so close. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay online to read my take on the inevitability of ping pong politics, and we'll see you here again on the next Washington Week Webcast Extra.